This year at Brighton Women's Centre, we have been celebrating our 50th birthday. Looking back at our history, we've seen a tale of tenacity, strength, and most of all, survival. BWC has weathered many storms and encountered many highs and lows. This is also the story of women's fight for equality over the past 5 decades. Today, you will hear from Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and author of multiple books including Women versus Capitalism and Prisonomics. This year's International Women's Day campaign theme is Accelerate Action, emphasising the importance of taking swift and decisive steps to achieve gender equality. Why is accelerating action for economic inequality for women still so pressing?
The main problem is that although there have been substantial improvements in women's employability and employment itself, so more education, more women coming into the workforce, more women perhaps joining political parties and also being elected in parliament. I mean, what we actually still, unfortunately, are facing is that on overall equality, we're lagging behind. And the recent estimates from the World Economic Forum are that it's going to take more than 100 years to achieve equality across the world if we continue at the current pace. And in fact, in a number of cases, we've seen a bit of a reversal taking place. So it is an issue worldwide. It varies hugely, of course, from region to region, but even in the developed world, we have a long way to go.
This Women's History Month, BWC has been reflecting on what has changed for women since we were founded in 1974. How has the economic position of women changed over the last 50 years?
Well, the interesting thing is that certainly in the UK, the pay gap has changed quite considerably. So it's become smaller, considerably smaller. So that's one advantage that we've seen in terms of pushing for women's equality. What we've also seen, of course, is that there have been changes in the legislation which are guaranteeing, although of course it isn't always the case, but at least it's meant to guarantee equal pay and non-discrimination. So legislation has been on the side of women's employment and fairness in terms of their rights. Maternity leave and pay has also improved. But really what we find is that despite all this, and despite the fact that we're seeing many more women now in leadership positions and on boards, the reality is that the pay gap is still there, which actually is a very good indicator of economic equality. And what we're also seeing is that for a very large percentage of women, they work part-time. Part-time work has still a very large gap per hour by comparison to hourly full-time rates for men. 34% is quite a big gap. It doesn't seem to be getting considerably smaller, unfortunately. What it does mean is that women's lifetime earnings still remain considerably lower than those of men. Their wealth at pension age remains considerably lower than that of men's. It's calculated between being only about a third or a fifth of what men have earned and therefore accumulated wealth during their lifetime. And that's a real issue. So there is huge inequality, which means that women are not as independent as we'd like to think that they are, despite all the advances that have been made. Because if you're not economically independent, then you are not equal in terms of decision making and in terms really of your position in society and also what it means for your children. And that is a worry. So yes, a lot of progress. Yes, legislation has been on women's side to a considerable extent. Some of the men's rents, if you want to call them that, which they have enjoyed for ages in terms of not having competition from the women in various areas, are slowly eroded away, but they're still there. The huge amount of sexism that exists across many sectors, not just in the financial industry, but also we've been hearing recently in the NHS and elsewhere. And that's a considerable worry. That, of course, tends to discourage women from staying on, from rising to the positions where they should be. And for the economy as a whole, what you get if you don't use your resources properly, then you get less growth, less productivity, there's less competition for jobs, not the best people get them, and the economy in the long term suffers.
In your experience, how mainstream is meaningful gender analysis among economists and policymakers?
There is a certain amount of thought given to looking at the gender implications, if you like, of particular policies. I did a debate just recently in one of the universities on whether foreign policy should be also looking at gender when it defines what it is that it wants to do, or gender equality, which is absolutely essential, because if one isn't focusing on this, then one does end up with the countries where we're providing aid, for example, even though that's now being cut, also not doing particularly well because that gender inequality continues. So there are so many areas where you can look at policy and think about gender and think about it more creatively. Another one, of course, more domestically, is to do with the cost of living, and women who are the main providers, if you like, in terms of being the ones who provide for their family. I don't necessarily mean they're the best, they're breadwinners, but they are certainly the ones who make the decisions in terms of how money is spent, can see and feel the cost of living increase that we've experienced since COVID and since the war in Ukraine in particular. They feel it a lot more intensely than is the case for the men. And of course, they see the basket of goods that they buy on a daily or weekly basis a lot more than perhaps the men who don't do that as often, although things are changing, of course, quite significantly. What it means is that even when you're looking at inflation and the basket of goods that you need to be looking at as part of what the Office for National Statistics, for example, does in putting out its consumer price index every month, one needs to take a lot more account of the realities on the ground. And that has been mentioned now a number of times, and I think there is an attempt to widen the way in which policy is looked at to incorporate some of those elements, because it may make for better policy in the longer term. Another one is to do with how to ensure there is less harassment and sexism in various areas, and legislation, of course, needs to be continuously tightened in that, and we've seen some elements of that happening. Interestingly, even some of the regulations we have don't seem to necessarily work particularly well. So, for example, there was a study of HR managers recently. Actually, it looked at what HR questions are asked for recruitment and found that a third of the interviews asked the woman how they were going to look after their child. And they don't ask that of the man. And in any case, it's illegal. So how you look after your children should be something that is very much part of what private decision making is all about. But also, of course, there is the question of why do you ask a woman and not a man? That's discriminatory. And then finally, in terms of children, what we've also seen is, which is very welcome, is the decision to make access to the childcare sort of availability that may exist to a wider set of children, which means therefore that if you start from very early on, you can look at perhaps women being more able to get back to work than was the case before. And another issue, of course, which I'm sure is related to what you're all up to, is to do with looking at women differently when it comes to how criminal justice is, the systems are developed. And of course, there is now a lot of emphasis on looking at women differently and their needs differently and their backgrounds to be taken into account more when decisions are made in terms of sentencing, for example, but also realizing the cost to society of putting women in prison when the impact is so much greater than is the case for men. So gender focused approaches in policy are absolutely essential. And I think we are beginning to understand that a little bit better. It's taken quite some time. The cost of children in care if their mothers go to prison is enormous and dwarfs anything that is spent on just sending someone in prison. And the longer term impacts on society are also huge, a lot less than if a man goes to prison. So there are so many areas where women's needs and circumstances and the look for greater equality and the betterment, if you like, of prosperity and the economy are so important and need a more gender focused approach.
PwC is one of the oldest women's centres in the UK, and a large part of our history is our work with women in the criminal justice system. We see the myriad of ways that the system does not work for women. Having written on this subject, could you tell us about the economic cost of keeping women in prison?
Well, there's first of all, of course, the cost of putting anyone in prison, which is in itself, quite a few tens of thousands of pounds, plus the whole criminal justice system around it. And the real question is whether it makes any sense at all, given that prison is not a deterrent for crime, and what you want to do is reduce crime, to put women in prison rather than ensuring that they get the support that they need to avoid getting even nearer the system. And then if they are caught by the system, if you like, being able to re-establish themselves in society and become a member of society that works, contributes, and is able also to look after their family. And what we find is that the moment you put women in prison, all that gets completely interrupted and can never recover. And then, of course, it just leads to possibly more crimes being committed. And we do know the facts in terms of the percentage of women, in fact, the majority of women who go to prison having been subjected to domestic abuse and violence, and also, of course, having been under the influence of drugs or alcohol abuse. But generally, there are women who need help rather than women who have committed a crime and therefore need to go to prison. So the question is, how do you avoid committing that crime? And then, of course, there is the extra cost. Not only are these women unable afterwards to contribute to society, but also their children, because we do know the facts again. They seem to be the same, have stayed the same for decades, which is that when a man goes to prison, his children tend to stay in their home, whereas if a woman goes to prison, only 1 in 10 of children do stay there. They get complete disruption in their studies, disruption in their lives, have to move somewhere else, and then we do know that the evidence again suggests that they end up more likely to commit crimes later on, or to be disruptive in society, and also, of course, more likely to end up in prison. And the care system, the care cost of looking after children of mothers who've been to prison can be very, very large. And really, by sending women to prison for short periods, for small offences, which then disrupts their ability to work, is a sure way of ensuring that crime happens again. So we don't rehabilitate women in prison. We end up with them actually being more likely to commit a further offence than would have been the case otherwise.
At BWC, one of the key impacts we hope to have is that the women we work with feel heard. What key economic issue would you like to be heard for women this year?
The worrying thing about women in society, and certainly this is the case in the UK, is that they occupy the areas which are less well paid, so that there is ghettoization that happens. So low pay occupations tend to be also the ones that mostly women are involved in. So if the economy slows down, or the economy sees cost of living still remaining high, then it is those women who are most affected and their families. And what we're seeing right now, of course, is welfare cuts, which are coming. And we've also seen an increase in taxation on employers, which has been done in such a way that it actually disadvantages mostly those who get paid less and those who do part-time work, which is actually what most women do in those low-paid occupations. I should add that I think the percentage of women working part-time is just under 40% in the UK, which is very high of those employed, which means that you get caught out immediately if there are circumstances that change in terms of your employment, and if people feel who are employing you that you have become more costly because of the changes that policy is making, such as reducing the threshold for when the employer starts to pay national insurance contribution to such a level that anyone earning more than 100 quid a week gets caught out with this higher extra tax, which the employer has to pay. It means that the chances of being employed is considerably smaller because they become more expensive. So it hits women in particular. Women, of course, who use part-time work as their main source of income, whereas for men, they do it as an add-on to perhaps another full-time job they have to improve the income of their family. So there is a particular issue that is likely to be affecting women in the future and in the UK, and that is to do with changes in policy, which perhaps were intended to just raise sufficient amounts of money for the government to spend in various services that they want to spend it on, that actually is catching women disproportionately because they are among the lower paid strand in society, and they are the ones who are most likely to be affected by those changes, including, of course, what may be happening on the welfare front with the changes that are taking place right now.